The flames had already consumed half the stable when Grace Lawton realized her 3-year-old son was still inside. She had been hanging laundry behind the main house when the first wisps of smoke caught her attention, drifting across the afternoon sky like gray ribbons against the Nevada sun. By the time she dropped the wet shirt in her hands and ran toward the structure, orange tongues were licking up the wooden walls with terrifying speed. The dry summer of 1878 had turned everything in Silver Peak into kindling, and now her worst nightmare was unfolding before her eyes. Thomas. Her scream tore through her throat as she stumbled across the dusty yard. "Thomas, baby, where are you?" She had seen him just minutes before, playing near the stable door with his wooden horse, the one her late husband had carved for him before the fever took him 6 months ago. She had turned her back for just a moment, just long enough to carry the basket to the clothesline. How could fire spread so quickly? How could the world change so completely in the span of a heartbeat? Grace reached the stable entrance and was driven back by a wall of heat that seemed to have physical weight. The smoke billowed out thick and black, choking off her air, stinging her eyes until tears streamed down her face. She tried again, pulling her apron up over her mouth and nose, but the heat was too intense. The roar of the fire was deafening now, a living thing that crackled and hissed with hunger. "Help!" she screamed, spinning around to look for anyone who might hear. "Someone help me! My son is in there!" But the Lawton property sat at the edge of Silver Peak, far enough from town that her nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away. Her 2 ranch hands had ridden out that morning to check the fence lines and would not be back until evening. She was alone, completely and utterly alone, and her baby was trapped in an inferno. Grace tried once more to push through the entrance, but the flames had spread across the doorframe now, and even getting close enough to see inside was impossible. The heat seared her face and hands. She could smell her own hair singeing. Desperation clawed at her chest as she circled the building, looking for another way in, but the fire had taken hold of the entire structure with shocking speed. The dry wood popped and cracked, and somewhere inside she could hear the terrified screaming of the 2 horses that had been in their stalls. "Thomas." Her voice was raw now, barely more than a rasp. "Thomas, Mama's here, Mama's coming." But she was not coming. She could not get to him. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and her knees buckled. This could not be happening. She could not lose her son too, not after losing William, not after everything they had already survived. Thomas was all she had left, the only light in her world since her husband had died and left her to manage a failing cattle ranch in the unforgiving Nevada desert. Through the smoke and heat shimmer, Grace saw movement. A figure on horseback was approaching fast, riding hard down the dirt road that connected her property to the main route into Silver Peak. For a wild moment her heart leaped with hope, but then reality crashed back. Even with help, how could anyone get past those flames? How could anyone survive going into that burning hell? The rider pulled up his horse in a spray of dust and was off the animal before it had fully stopped. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the dusty clothes of a working cowboy and a hat pulled low over his face. Grace had never seen him before, but she did not care who he was. She grabbed his arm the moment he was close enough. "My son." The words came out as a sob. "He's inside. He's only 3 years old, please, you have to help him." The cowboy's eyes were a startling shade of blue-gray, like storm clouds over the mountains. They swept over the burning stable, taking in the situation with a speed that spoke of a mind accustomed to quick assessment. Grace saw his jaw tighten, saw the way his hands flexed at his sides. He looked at her for one brief moment, and in his eyes she saw understanding and determination, and something else she could not quite name. Then, without a single word, He was moving. He strode toward the stable entrance with purposeful steps, pulling his bandana up over his nose and mouth. Grace stumbled after him, wanting to warn him, wanting to tell him it was impossible, but her voice would not work anymore. She watched as he paused just outside the wall of flames, saw him take one deep breath, and then he was gone, disappearing into the smoke and fire like a ghost. Time stopped. The world narrowed to the roaring inferno before her and the terrible silence from within. Grace could not breathe, could not think, could not do anything but stand there with her hands pressed against her mouth, every muscle in her body rigid with terror. She had sent a stranger to his death. That was all she could think. This man, whoever he was going to die in that fire trying to save her son, and it was her fault. Seconds stretched into eternities. The fire roared louder, and part of the roof collapsed with a shower of sparks that shot into the sky like angry fireflies. Grace heard herself making sounds, animal sounds of fear and grief, but they seemed to come from far away. Her vision was tunneling, the edges going dark. Then a shape emerged from the smoke. The cowboy came through the flames like a demon rising from hell itself, his clothes smoking, his hat gone, and in his arms was a small bundle wrapped in what looked like a horse blanket. He was coughing violently, his steps unsteady, but he kept moving, kept walking even as burning debris fell around him. Grace was running before she even realized she had moved. She reached him just as his knees started to buckle, and together they collapsed onto the ground several yards from the stable. The cowboy was still coughing deep, racking coughs that shook his entire frame, but he carefully, so carefully, passed the bundle to her. Grace's hands were shaking so badly she could barely unwrap the blanket. When she finally got it open, Thomas's small face appeared, streaked with soot but breathing. His eyes were closed, and for one horrible moment she thought they were too late, but then he coughed and his eyes fluttered open. "Mama," his voice was tiny, confused. "Oh God, oh thank God." Grace clutched him to her chest, pressing her face against his hair, feeling his small heart beating against her own. She was crying so hard she could barely breathe, but she did not care. He was alive. Her son was alive. She looked up at the cowboy, who was sitting on the ground now, his arms braced on his knees, still coughing. His face was blackened with soot, his shirt had burned holes across the shoulders, and his hands looked red and raw. But his eyes, when they met hers, were calm. "Thank you," Grace whispered, but the words felt entirely inadequate for what he had just done. "Thank you, I don't know how to," he shook his head, cutting her off, and she realized he still had not spoken a word. Behind them, the stable finally gave way completely, the walls collapsing inward with a roar and a burst of sparks. The horses must have gotten out somehow, because Grace could see them now, galloping across the far pasture, manes flying. The building was a total loss, but she did not care. Buildings could be rebuilt. Her son could not be replaced. "We need to get him to the doctor," the cowboy said, and Grace was startled by his voice. It was rough, deeper than she expected, but there was something gentle in it too. "Smoke like that, he needs to be checked." Grace nodded, unable to form words. She tried to stand with Thomas in her arms, but her legs were shaking too badly. The cowboy rose, steadier now despite what he had just endured, and held out his hands. "May I?" She hesitated only a moment before letting him take Thomas, who had already drifted back into unconsciousness. The cowboy held him with surprising care, as if he had done this before, and walked toward where his horse was standing, ground tied and watching the fire with rolling eyes. "Can you ride?" he asked Grace. She nodded, finding her voice. "Yes." "Then we'll go together, faster that way." He mounted the horse with Thomas secured in one arm, then reached down to help Grace up. She settled behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist to steady herself, very aware of the solid warmth of his body even through the smoke-damaged shirt. He urged the horse into a gallop, and they raced toward Silver Peak as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. The town of Silver Peak had grown up around a silver mine that had played out 3 years ago, but enough people had stayed to keep it alive as a modest ranching and trading community. The main street was a dusty strip lined with false-fronted buildings, including a general store, a saloon, a hotel, and the small office that served as both doctor's surgery and occasional courthouse. The cowboy pulled up outside the doctor's office and dismounted carefully, handing Thomas down to Grace before helping her down as well. Her whole body felt like it was made of something insubstantial, like she might blow away in the wind. She cradled Thomas against her chest and pushed through the door without knocking. Dr. Ephraim Chen looked up from the ledger he had been writing in, his weathered face registering surprise and then immediate concern. He was a middle-aged Chinese man who had come to Silver Peak during the mining boom and stayed after it ended, one of the few who had managed to establish a respected place in the community, despite the prejudice that ran through most Western towns. He had delivered Thomas and had been the one to tell Grace there was nothing more to be done for William when the fever took hold. "Grace, what happened?" He was already coming around his desk, clearing a space on the examination table. "Fire, the stable, he was inside." The words came out in fragments. Grace laid Thomas on the table, her hands reluctant to let go of him. Dr. Chen began his examination immediately, his hands gentle and sure as he checked Thomas's breathing, looked in his mouth and nose, listened to his chest. The cowboy had followed them in and now stood near the door, his presence solid and somehow comforting despite the fact that Grace still did not know his name. "His breathing sounds relatively clear," Dr. Chen said after a few minutes, "which is very fortunate. The smoke damage could have been much worse. How long was he in there?" "I don't know." Grace pressed a hand to her mouth. 5 minutes, 10, it felt like forever. "You got him out quickly then. That likely saved his life." Dr. Chen glanced toward the cowboy. "You look like you could use some attention yourself." The cowboy shook his head. "The boy first. I can manage both. Sit down before you fall down." There was an authority in Dr. Chen's voice that seemed to override any argument. The cowboy moved to one of the wooden chairs along the wall and sat, looking suddenly exhausted. Grace saw now that his hands were definitely burned, the skin angry red across the palms and fingers. Dr. Chen worked efficiently, mixing up a solution to help Thomas breathe easier, carefully cleaning the soot from his face and mouth. Thomas woke again during this, crying weakly, and Grace was there immediately, soothing him with her voice and her touch. "Mama's here, sweetheart. You're safe now. You're going to be fine." "It hurt," Thomas whimpered. "It was hot and I was scared." "I know, baby, I know, but you're safe now. A very brave man went into the fire and brought you out." Thomas's eyes, red-rimmed and watering, turned toward the cowboy. "Mister saved me." The cowboy met the child's gaze and nodded slightly, his expression softening in a way that did something strange to Grace's heart. Dr. Chen finished with Thomas and declared that he would recover fully with rest and plenty of fluids, though they should watch for any breathing difficulties over the next few days. Then he turned his attention to the cowboy, who tried again to protest that he was fine. "Your hands are burned and you have soot in your lungs," Dr. Chen said firmly. "Let me do my job." The cowboy finally relented, holding out his hands for examination. Dr. Chen cleaned them carefully and applied a salve that made the cowboy wince despite his obvious attempt to remain stoic. Grace watched from where she sat with Thomas in her lap, seeing details about this stranger now that the immediate crisis had passed. He was younger than she had first thought, probably around 30 years old. His hair, dark with sweat and soot, showed hints of brown when the light caught it. His face had the weathered quality of someone who spent his life outdoors, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more than he frowned. His hands, even burned and damaged, were strong and capable. Everything about him spoke of quiet competence, of a man who knew what he was about and did not waste time on unnecessary words. As if feeling her gaze, he looked up and their eyes met. Grace felt her breath catch. There was something in that look, something that went beyond gratitude and beyond the circumstances that had brought them together. It was a moment of connection, of recognition, as if they knew each other from some other place and time. She looked away first, her cheeks warming in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. "What is your name?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Gabriel Zander," he said. "Most folks call me Gabe. I'm Grace Lawton. This is Thomas." She tightened her arms around her son. "I don't know how to thank you for what you did. You saved his life. You risked your own life without even thinking about it." "There was a child in danger," Gabe said simply, as if that explained everything. "Wasn't anything to think about. You could have died. But I didn't." His eyes held hers. "And neither did your son. That's what matters." Dr. Chen finished bandaging Gabe's hands and gave him instructions for care, along with a stern warning to watch for signs of infection. He gave similar instructions to Grace for Thomas, then refused payment from either of them. "There's been enough loss today," he said. "I won't add to your burdens." Grace wanted to argue, but she knew her financial situation was precarious enough that the saved expense was a genuine relief. She thanked him profusely and carefully stood with Thomas, who had fallen asleep again against her shoulder. Outside, the sun had dipped lower, painting the street in shades of gold and amber. Grace's legs still felt unsteady, and the reality of what had happened was beginning to truly sink in. The stable was gone. The hay and grain stored there were gone. The tack and tools she could not afford to replace were gone. And she had come within minutes, maybe seconds, of losing everything that truly mattered. "How did you know?" she asked Gabe as they stood on the boardwalk outside the doctor's office. "How did you know to come?" "I was riding into town from the east," he explained. "Saw the smoke column. When I got close enough to see it was a building fire and not a brush fire, I rode toward it." He paused. "Seemed like the thing to do. Where are you from?" "Colorado, originally. Been moving around the last few years, taking work where I can find it." He glanced at his bandaged hands with a wry expression. "Ranch work mostly when my hands are functional." Grace felt a sudden panic at the thought of him moving on, this stranger who had appeared like an answer to a prayer and would now disappear just as quickly. "You'll need somewhere to stay while those hands heal. I have a spare room in the house. It's the least I can offer after what you did." Gabe hesitated, and Grace could see him weighing the offer. "I don't want to impose. It's not an imposition. It's necessary." She shifted Thomas's weight in her arms. "You can't work like that, and you shouldn't be alone while you recover. Please." "I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because you were too proud to accept help." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes. "All right," he said. "Thank you." They collected his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that looked as trail-worn as its rider, and began the walk back to Grace's property. The sun was setting now, turning the sky into a riot of reds and oranges that seemed cruel in their beauty after the fire. As they approached the ranch, Grace could see the ruins of the stable still smoking, a skeleton of blackened beams against the twilight. The main house was intact, a modest two-story structure that William had built with his own hands during their first year of marriage. Grace led Gabe inside, suddenly very aware of the worn furniture and faded curtains, the signs of a household struggling to make ends meet. But if Gabe noticed or cared, he gave no indication. "The spare room is upstairs, first door on the right," Grace said. "There's a bed and a basin for washing. It's not much, but it's clean." "It's more than enough," Gabe replied. "Thank you." Grace carried Thomas up to his small room and laid him in his bed, carefully removing his soot-stained clothes and cleaning his face and hands with a damp cloth. He barely stirred, exhausted by his ordeal. She sat beside him for a long time, just watching him breathe, reassuring herself that he was real and alive and safe. When she finally went back downstairs, she found Gabe standing in front of the window, looking out at the ruins of the stable. He had attempted to wash up, though his face still bore traces of soot, and he had removed his ruined shirt, revealing a plain undershirt beneath. His bandaged hands hung at his sides. "I'll need to figure out what to do about the stable," Grace said, more to herself than to him. "The horses will need shelter, and I'll have to replace the tack and tools. I don't know how I'm going to manage it. The ranch barely breaks even as it is." Gabe turned to look at her. "How long have you been running this place alone?" "6 months, since my husband died." The words still hurt to say. William had plans to expand to breed better cattle, but then he got sick and everything fell apart. "I've been trying to hold it together, but I don't know if I can. I don't know anything about ranching. I was a school teacher before we married." "You've kept it going this long," Gabe observed. "That's something." "Is it? I lost the stable. I nearly lost my son. Maybe I'm just fooling myself thinking I can make this work." Grace sank into one of the chairs at the kitchen table, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion. "I should probably sell and move back east, but this was William's dream. It's all Thomas has left of his father." Gabe was quiet for a moment, then moved to sit across from her at the table. "If you want to keep the ranch going, you're going to need help. Real help, not just a couple of hands to ride fence lines. I can't afford to hire anyone else." "What if it wasn't about money?" Grace looked up at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm here anyway while my hands heal. Might as well make myself useful. I know ranching, I know horses and cattle, and I know building. I could help you rebuild the stable, get things organized, in exchange for room and board." "You don't have to do that. You've already done so much." "Maybe I want to." Gabe met her eyes steadily. "I've been drifting for 3 years now, taking short-term work and moving on. Maybe it's time to stay somewhere for a while. See if I remember what that's like." There was something in his voice, a hint of loneliness or loss, that resonated with Grace's own grief. She found herself nodding before she had fully thought it through. "All right," she said. "If you're sure. But as soon as you can find paying work elsewhere, you're not obligated to stay. Understood?" Grace stood and moved to the stove, still warm from that morning's breakfast. "I should make something to eat. You must be hungry after everything. Let me help. Your hands can still be useful, even bandaged." Gabe rose and joined her near the stove. "Just tell me what to do." They worked together in the small kitchen, an easy silence falling between them. Grace found herself acutely aware of his presence, the way he moved with quiet efficiency, the way he seemed to understand what she needed before she asked. It was strange having another adult in the house after so many months of solitude broken only by Thomas's chatter, and the ranch hand's occasional reports. They ate a simple meal of beans and cornbread, sitting across from each other at the table as the last light faded from the windows. Grace told him about the ranch, about William's plans and dreams, about the struggles of the last 6 months. Gabe listened more than he spoke, but when he did offer observations or suggestions, they were practical and thoughtful. After dinner, Grace checked on Thomas again and found him sleeping peacefully. When she came back downstairs, Gabe was at the window again, looking out into the darkness. "I keep thinking about those few minutes," Grace said softly, "when I couldn't get to him. When I thought I was going to lose him. I've never felt so helpless in my life. But you didn't lose him, because of you." She moved to stand beside him. "You didn't hesitate, you just went in." "Why?" Gabe was quiet for a long moment. "I had a brother," he finally said. "Younger than me by 5 years. When I was 18 and he was 13, our barn caught fire. I got the horses out, got my parents out, but Jake was in the loft and I couldn't reach him. The fire moved too fast, the ladder collapsed. I tried, but I couldn't get to him." Grace felt her heart constrict. "Gabe, I'm so sorry. It was a long time ago, 12 years. His voice was level, but she could hear the old pain beneath it. "But I swore that if I ever had another chance, if I ever saw someone trapped in a fire, I wouldn't fail again." "So when you said your son was in there wasn't a choice. There was just what needed to be done." Grace understood then, understood the shadows in his eyes and the way he had moved without hesitation into the flames. He had been trying to save his brother all over again, trying to redeem a moment from his past that could never truly be redeemed. Except this time he had succeeded. "You saved him," she said firmly. "You saved Thomas, and in doing that you saved me too. I hope you know that." Gabe turned to look at her, and in the dim lamplight his eyes were soft. "I'm glad I was there." They stood that way for a moment longer, something unspoken passing between them. Then Grace remembered herself and stepped back, suddenly flustered. "You should rest," she said. "Those burns need time to heal, and you breathed in a lot of smoke." "So did you," Gabe pointed out. "You tried to go in after him. But I couldn't, I wasn't strong enough." The admission hurt. "You're stronger than you think." Gabe's voice was gentle. "Running this place alone, raising a child, keeping everything going after losing your husband. That takes a different kind of strength, the kind that lasts." Grace felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. No one had told her she was strong in so long. Everyone in Silver Peak looked at her with pity, the poor widow who was in over her head. But Gabe saw something else, something she had almost forgotten about herself. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded and headed for the stairs, moving carefully. Grace watched him go, then banked the fire and extinguished the lamps, moving through the familiar evening routine. But everything felt different now. The house did not feel as empty. The silence did not feel as heavy. She climbed the stairs and checked on Thomas one more time, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Then she went to her own room, but sleep was a long time coming. She kept seeing Gabe disappearing into those flames, kept feeling that moment of absolute terror, kept remembering the profound relief when he had emerged with Thomas in his arms. She had known this man for less than a day, but he had already changed everything. The next morning dawned clear and hot, promising another scorching day. Grace woke early out of habit and found Gabe already in the kitchen, attempting to make coffee with his bandaged hands. He looked up when she entered, looking slightly embarrassed. "Sorry, I'm making a mess of this." "Here, let me." Grace took over, measuring out the grounds and setting the pot on the stove. "How are your hands this morning?" "Sore, but I've had worse." They had breakfast together, a simple meal of eggs and biscuits. Thomas woke and came downstairs, still subdued but looking better than he had the night before. He was shy around Gabe at first, hiding behind Grace's skirts, but when Gabe produced a small carved horse from his pocket and offered it to him, the boy's eyes went wide. "For me." "If your mother says it's all right." Grace nodded, touched by the gesture. Thomas took the horse carefully and immediately began making it gallop across the table, complete with sound effects. It was the most animated he had been since the fire, and Grace felt something loosen in her chest. After breakfast, Grace's two ranch hands arrived, having spent the previous night at the line shack on the far end of the property. They were alarmed to see the stable ruins and to hear what had happened, and grateful that Thomas was safe. Grace introduced them to Gabe, explaining that he would be staying on to help for a while. The older of the two men, a grizzled cowboy named Pete who had worked for William, looked Gabe over with assessing eyes. "That was a brave thing you did, riding into that fire." "It needed doing," Gabe replied simply. Pete nodded, apparently satisfied. "Well, we can use another hand around here, especially one who knows what he's about. This place has been struggling." Grace felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment, but she could not deny the truth of it. The ranch had been struggling, and she had been fighting a losing battle trying to manage everything herself. Over the next few days, a routine developed. Dr. Chen came out to check on Thomas and pronounced him fully recovered, then redressed Gabe's burns and said they were healing well. Gabe, despite his injured hands, made himself useful in countless ways. He could not do heavy work yet, but he had a keen eye for organization and efficiency. He helped Grace plan out the stable rebuild, choosing a location slightly farther from the house and designing it with better fire safety in mind. He looked over the ranch's books, such as they were, and made suggestions for cutting costs and improving income. Grace found herself relying on his judgment more and more, found herself seeking him out to discuss decisions and plans. They fell into an easy partnership, working side by side during the days and talking long into the evenings after Thomas was in bed. She learned that Gabe had grown up on a ranch in Colorado, that he had spent time working cattle drives and breaking horses, that he had a quiet love for the land and animals that matched her late husband's passion. She also learned that he was kind and patient with Thomas, never brushing off the boy's endless questions or his desire to follow Gabe around like a shadow. Thomas had been so lost after William's death, so quiet and withdrawn. But Gabe's gentle presence seemed to draw him out again, returning some of the sparkle to his eyes. One evening, about a week after the fire, Grace was sitting on the porch watching the sunset when Gabe joined her. His bandages were lighter now, and he had started doing more work around the ranch as his hands healed. "Thomas is asleep," he said. "He wanted me to tell you good night." Grace smiled. "He adores you. I've never seen him attached to someone so quickly. He's a good kid, smart and curious. He misses his father terribly. William used to spend hours with him, teaching him about the ranch, about horses and cattle. Thomas was only 2.5 when William died, but he remembers. Sometimes at night he cries for his papa." Grace's voice caught slightly. "I never know what to say to make it better." Gabe was quiet for a moment. "You can't make it better, you can just be there while it hurts. That's all anyone can do." "Is that what you did after your brother for a while?" "Then I ran away from it. I left home when I was 19, told myself I was looking for adventure. Really, I was just trying to escape the memories." He leaned against the porch railing, looking out over the darkening land. "It doesn't work, though. You take your ghosts with you wherever you go." "Do you still see your parents?" "No. They stayed on the ranch in Colorado. I haven't been back in 11 years. There was regret in his voice. "I send letters sometimes, but it's not the same. I think they blame me for what happened to Jake. I know I blame myself." Grace stood and moved closer to him. "It wasn't your fault. Fire is unpredictable. You did everything you could." "Did I? I've spent 12 years wondering if I missed something, if there was some way I could have reached him. Maybe if I had been faster or braver or—" "Stop." Grace put her hand on his arm, feeling the warmth of his skin through his shirt sleeve. "You can't torture yourself with maybes. I know about that game. I played it for months after William died. Maybe if I had called the doctor sooner, maybe if I had tried a different treatment, maybe if I had prayed harder, It doesn't change anything. It just makes the grief sharper." Gabe looked down at her, and in the fading light his eyes were deep and searching. "How did you survive it, losing him?" "I had Thomas. I had to survive for him. And I had the ranch. Even though I didn't know what I was doing, it gave me something to focus on besides the pain." She paused. And eventually, slowly, the sharp edges dulled. The grief is still there, but it's not all there is anymore. There's room for other things now. Joy sometimes. Hope, maybe. Hope for what? Grace was not sure how to answer that. What did she hope for? To keep the ranch running, to give Thomas a good life. Those were the practical hopes, the everyday ones. But standing here with Gabe in the twilight, she felt the stirring of something else, something she had thought dead and buried with William. "I don't know yet," she said softly, "but I think I'm starting to remember what it feels like." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Gabe's hand came up to cover hers where it still rested on his arm, his touch careful and warm despite the healing burns. Grace's heart was beating faster, and she could not seem to look away from his eyes. Then Thomas's voice called from inside, "Mama!" And the spell broke. Grace stepped back, flustered, and hurried inside to check on her son, who had woken from a bad dream. By the time she got him settled again, Gabe had gone up to his room and the moment had passed. But something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that could not be taken back. As summer deepened into late August, work began on the new stable. Gabe's hands had healed enough for him to do physical labor again, and he threw himself into the construction with focused energy. He hired a couple of local men to help, paying them out of his own savings despite Grace's protests. The structure went up quickly under his direction, built with care and attention to safety that the original stable had lacked. Grace watched him work, admiring the competence and pride he took in doing things right. She found herself noticing other things too, the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders when he lifted a beam, the sound of his laugh when one of the other workers told a joke, the gentleness in his hands when he showed Thomas how to hammer a nail. She tried to tell herself she was being foolish. It had only been 6 months since William died. She should still be in mourning, should still be focused on nothing but keeping her late husband's dream alive. But her heart seemed to have other ideas. It lifted when Gabe came into a room. It raced when their hands accidentally touched. It ached when she thought about him eventually moving on, returning to his drifter's life. She was falling in love with him. The realization came to her one morning as she stood at the kitchen window watching him work with the horses. It should have terrified her, this quick and unexpected feeling. Instead, it felt like waking up after a long sleep, like remembering how to be fully alive. But she did not know if Gabe felt the same. He was kind to her, certainly, and there were moments when she caught him looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. But he had never said anything, never indicated that his feelings went beyond gratitude and friendship. One evening in early September, they were sitting on the porch after dinner when Grace finally gathered the courage to broach the subject. Thomas was playing in the yard, chasing fireflies in the gathering dusk. "The stable is almost finished," she said, trying to keep her voice casual. "You've done incredible work." "It's been good to build something again," Gabe replied. "I'd forgotten how satisfying it is to see something come together from nothing." "What will you do when it's done? Will you stay on, or will you move on to find paying work?" Gabe was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want me to do?" Grace's heart hammered in her chest. "I want you to stay. The ranch is doing better with your help. Thomas loves you, and she stopped, not quite brave enough to say the rest. "And you," Gabe's voice was soft, encouraging. "And I've gotten used to having you here," she finished, the words falling far short of what she really meant. Gabe turned to face her fully. "Grace, I need to tell you something. I should have told you weeks ago, but I couldn't find the right words." A knot of anxiety formed in Grace's stomach. "What is it?" "I'm not planning to leave. I haven't been planning to leave since about the second day I was here." He ran a hand through his hair, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I know it's too soon. I know you just lost your husband and you're still grieving. But I need you to know that I'm staying because I want to, not because I feel obligated. I'm staying because being here, working this ranch, being with you and Thomas, it's made me feel more at home than I've felt in 12 years. Grace could barely breathe. "Gabe, let me finish," he said gently. "I know I'm just a drifter with nothing to my name. I know you could probably find a dozen better men if you wanted. But if you'll have me, if you'll let me, I'd like to stay. Not as a hired hand, but as a partner. In the ranch, in raising Thomas, in everything." "Are you saying—" "I'm saying I love you, Grace." The words came out raw and honest. "I think I started falling in love with you that first night, watching you fight so hard to save your son, seeing your strength and your courage. And every day since then, I've fallen deeper. I love your determination and your kindness. I love the way you laugh at Thomas's silly jokes. I love how you never give up, even when things seem impossible. I love you, and if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving that you didn't make a mistake in letting me stay." Grace felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "You think I could find a dozen better men?" Of all the things she could have said, it clearly was not what Gabe expected. "Well, I just meant there is no better man," Grace said fiercely. "There's just you. The man who rode into fire to save my son. The man who stayed to help rebuild what was lost. The man who makes Thomas laugh and me remember what hope feels like." She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "I love you too, Gabe. I didn't think I should, but I can't help it. You've become part of everything I am, everything I want. The ranch, Thomas, that's my whole world now, and I don't want it any other way." Gabe's face transformed, joy breaking through his usual reserve like sunlight through clouds. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch reverent. "Can I kiss you, please?" He kissed her softly, carefully, as if she were something precious that might break. Grace melted into him, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, anchoring herself in the reality of this moment. The kiss deepened, becoming less tentative and more sure, a promise and a claiming all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Grace laughed shakily. "How long have you wanted to do that?" "Weeks," Gabe admitted. "Maybe since the first day. I just didn't think I had the right." "You have every right." Grace rested her forehead against his. "You have my whole heart, Gabe Zander, for whatever that's worth. It's worth everything." They sat together on the porch swing, Grace tucked against Gabe's side, his arm around her shoulders. Thomas eventually tired of chasing fireflies and came to climb into Grace's lap, his small body warm and sleep-heavy. He looked up at Gabe with drowsy eyes. "Are you going to stay forever?" he asked. Gabe glanced at Grace, who nodded encouragingly. "If it's all right with you, I'd like to." "Would you be my new papa?" The question hung in the air, weighted with meaning. Grace held her breath, waiting for Gabe's answer. She saw the emotion flash across his face, saw how much the question meant to him. "I would be honored," Gabe said, his voice rough with feeling. "But I won't ever try to replace your first papa. He was a good man and he loved you very much. I'll just be Gabe, someone else who loves you and wants to take care of you and your mama." Thomas considered this with the seriousness of childhood. "Okay, but can I still call you Papa sometimes?" "Anytime you want." Thomas smiled, satisfied, and snuggled deeper into Grace's arms. They sat that way until the stars came out, a family forming from the ashes of loss and the brave leap of new love. The wedding took place in October, when the brutal heat of summer had given way to cooler days, and the mountains were dusted with the first hint of snow. It was a simple ceremony in Silver Peak's small church, attended by the few people Grace and Gabe had come to know in town. Dr. Chen stood up with Gabe, and the owner of the general store stood with Grace. Thomas served as ring bearer, taking his duties with utmost seriousness. Grace wore a pale blue dress that had been her mother's, simple but elegant. Gabe wore his best clothes, which were not fancy but were clean and pressed. When they exchanged vows, promising to love and honor each other, Grace felt William's memory there not as a weight or a guilt, but as a blessing. He had taught her what love could be. Now Gabe was teaching her that love could come again, different but no less real. After the ceremony, they had a small celebration at the ranch. Pete and the other hands had strung up lanterns, and there was food and music and laughter. Thomas ran wild with the handful of other children present, his face flushed with excitement. Grace danced with Gabe under the stars, feeling more complete than she had in a very long time. "Happy," Gabe murmured as they swayed to the music. "Impossibly so," Grace replied. "Sometimes I can't believe this is real, that you're real. I'm real. This is real." He pulled her closer. "And I'm not going anywhere." That night, after the guests had gone and Thomas was asleep in his bed, Grace and Gabe retreated to the bedroom they would now share. There was nervousness in the air, but also anticipation and trust. Gabe was gentle and patient, and Grace found that giving herself to him felt not like a betrayal of William's memory, but like an affirmation of life and hope and the possibility of healing. Afterward, lying in his arms in the darkness, Grace felt a peace she had not known in years. The ranch was secure. Thomas was happy, and she had found love again in the most unexpected way with a man who had literally walked through fire for them. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For not riding past that day, for being brave enough to go into the flames, for staying, for loving us." Gabe kissed her temple. "Thank you for giving me a reason to stay, for giving me a home." They fell asleep that way, wrapped in each other and in the quiet contentment of knowing they had found where they belonged. The months that followed were not without challenges. Running a ranch in Nevada was never easy, and there were setbacks and hardships. A late freeze killed some of their cattle. A dry spell threatened the water supply. The price of beef dropped unexpectedly. But Gabe and Grace faced each problem together, pooling their different strengths and supporting each other through the difficulties. Gabe proved to be not just a skilled rancher, but also a smart businessman. He built relationships with buyers in California, found ways to cut costs without sacrificing quality, and slowly but steadily improved the ranch's profitability. Grace, meanwhile, brought organization and education to the operation, keeping meticulous records and teaching Thomas his letters and numbers in the evenings. Thomas thrived under their joint care. He grew stronger and more confident, learning ranch skills from Gabe while maintaining the gentle, curious nature that Grace nurtured. He called Gabe Papa more and more often, and while he still sometimes spoke of his first father with wistful memory, it was clear that Gabe had become his true parent in every way that mattered. As winter gave way to spring and then summer again, Grace began to suspect she might be pregnant. She waited to be sure before telling Gabe, spending anxious weeks hoping and wondering. When she finally confirmed it with Dr. Chen, she felt a mix of joy and apprehension. She had nearly died giving birth to Thomas, and the doctor had warned her that another pregnancy might be risky. But when she told Gabe, his reaction was one of pure delight tempered with concern for her well-being. "We'll make sure you have the best care," he said, his hand splayed protectively over her still flat stomach. "We'll do everything right. You and the baby will both be fine." "You can't promise that," Grace said, but she was smiling. Then I'll do everything in my power to make it true." And he did. As Grace's pregnancy progressed, Gabe took on more of the ranch duties so she could rest. He was attentive and caring, bringing her tea when she felt nauseous, rubbing her aching back, reading to her in the evenings. Thomas, told that he was going to be a big brother, was excited and helpful, fetching things for his mother and talking to her belly about all the things he would teach the baby. The pregnancy was not easy. Grace felt sicker and more tired than she had with Thomas, and as she grew larger, the Nevada heat became oppressive. There were days when she wondered if she would make it, days when fear threatened to overwhelm her. But Gabe was always there, steady and strong, reminding her that she was not alone. In March of 1880, 2 weeks before the baby was due, Grace went into labor. It happened in the middle of the night, and Gabe rode hard to town to fetch Dr. Chen while Pete stayed with Grace, trying to keep her calm. Thomas, woken by the commotion, was frightened until Grace managed to reassure him that everything would be all right. The labor was long and difficult. Dr. Chen arrived and set up in the bedroom, and Gabe stayed by Grace's side the entire time, holding her hand and talking her through each contraction. There were moments when Grace thought she could not go on, when the pain seemed too much to bear, but Gabe's voice kept anchoring her. "You can do this. You're the strongest person I know. Just a little longer, I'm right here. I'm not leaving." Finally, as dawn broke over the mountains, the baby came. The sound of a newborn's cry filled the room, and Grace collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but overwhelmed with relief. "It's a boy," Dr. Chen announced, cleaning the baby and wrapping him in a blanket. "A healthy boy." Gabe's eyes were wet as he looked at his son for the first time. Dr. Chen placed the baby in Grace's arms, and she marveled at the tiny, perfect face. He had dark hair like Gabe's and a strong, lusty cry that suggested he would have his father's determination. "He's beautiful," Grace whispered. "He's perfect," Gabe agreed. He kissed Grace's forehead, his hand gentle on the baby's head. "You're perfect. Thank you for this." They decided to name him Jacob, after Gabe's lost brother. It was a way of honoring the past while celebrating the future, a gesture that Gabe found both healing and hopeful. When Thomas was finally allowed to come meet his new brother, he was fascinated and gentle, stroking Jacob's tiny hand with one finger. "He's so small," Thomas said in wonder. "You were this small once," Grace told him. "Will he grow big like me, eventually? But it will take time." Thomas seemed satisfied with this. He appointed himself Jacob's protector immediately, always wanting to be nearby, always wanting to help with diaper changes and feedings. Grace watched her boys together and felt her heart swell with love. As Jacob grew from infant to baby to toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. Gabe's hard work and smart decisions were paying off, and for the first time since William's death, Grace felt financially secure. They were able to hire another hand, expand the herd, and even add a few improvements to the house. But more than the material success, Grace treasured the life they had built together. The sound of laughter in the house, the sight of Thomas teaching Jacob how to feed the chickens, the feeling of Gabe's arms around her at the end of a long day, these were the true riches. One evening when Jacob was 2 years old and Thomas was 7, the family was sitting on the porch watching the sunset. It had become a tradition, this quiet time together at the end of the day. Thomas was reading a book while Jacob played with a set of wooden blocks Gabe had made for him. "Do you remember the fire?" Thomas asked suddenly, looking up from his book. Grace and Gabe exchanged glances. Thomas rarely spoke of that day anymore. "I remember," Grace said carefully. "Do you?" "A little bit. I remember being scared and everything being hot, and then Papa carried me out." He looked at Gabe. "You were very brave. You were brave too, Gabe told him. You stayed calm and you survived. Mama says that's the day you came to stay with us forever. That's right. Thomas considered this. I'm glad there was a fire. Thomas, Grace was shocked. Not because it was scary, Thomas explained quickly, but because if there wasn't a fire, Papa wouldn't have come, and then we wouldn't be a family. Gabe's expression softened. We would have found each other somehow. Some things are meant to be. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. She thought about that terrible day, about the fear and desperation, about how close she had come to losing everything. But from those flames had come Gabe, and from Gabe had come love, and from love had come healing and family, and a future she had not dared to hope for. Your papa's right, she said, reaching over to ruffle Thomas's hair. We were meant to be a family, all of us. Jacob, not understanding the conversation but sensing the emotion, toddled over and climbed into Grace's lap. She held him close, breathing in his baby smell, feeling the solid weight of him. Thomas leaned against Gabe's side, and Gabe's arm came around him naturally. They sat that way as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. As the years passed, Thomas grew into a fine young man, tall and capable like Gabe, with Grace's sharp mind and gentle heart. Jacob grew up energetic and curious, always getting into mischief, but with a sweetness that made it impossible to stay mad at him. Grace and Gabe added 2 more children to their family, a daughter they named Sarah, and then another son named William, after Grace's first husband. The house was always full of noise and life and love. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Gabe's skill with horses became well known throughout Nevada, and people came from miles around to buy stock from the Zander Ranch. Grace started a small school on the property, teaching not just her own children, but also the children of neighboring ranchers and the few miners who still worked claims in the area. She discovered that she could honor both her lives, the one with William that had been cut short, and the one with Gabe that had grown beyond her wildest dreams. Gabe never forgot where he came from or the tragedy that had shaped him. When Jacob was 5 years old, Gabe finally wrote to his parents in Colorado, telling them about his life, his family, his happiness. To his surprise and joy, they wrote back. The letters were tentative at first, weighted with years of silence and grief, but gradually they warmed. Gabe learned that his father's health was failing, and he made the decision to take the family to Colorado for a visit. It was an emotional reunion. Gabe's parents were older, worn by hard living and loss, but their faces lit up when they met Grace and the children. They wept over Jacob, named for their lost son, and marveled at the strong, capable man Gabe had become. Over the course of a week, old wounds began to heal. Gabe's parents did not blame him for what had happened all those years ago. They never truly had. They had only lost one son to the fire. They had lost the other to grief and guilt. When it was time to return to Nevada, Gabe's parents promised to visit, and they kept that promise. The connection was re-established, bridges rebuilt across the years of separation. Life was not perfect. There were still hard times, still losses and disappointments. Sarah fell ill with scarlet fever when she was 4, and for 2 weeks Grace and Gabe barely slept, taking turns sitting up with her, sponging her burning skin, praying desperately for her recovery. When the fever finally broke and Sarah's eyes cleared, they held each other and cried with relief. One of the ranch hands was killed when his horse threw him against a rock, and Gabe had to tell the man's wife and children. It was a grim reminder of how quickly life could change, how fragile their happiness was. But it also reinforced their appreciation for each day, their determination to make the most of the time they had together. Thomas grew up and fell in love with the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a spirited young woman named Catherine who could ride and rope as well as any cowboy. Gabe and Grace gave their blessing, and the wedding was held on the ranch, with the whole community turning out to celebrate. Watching Thomas with his bride, seeing the way he looked at her with such devotion, Grace felt the circle completing. Her son, who had nearly died in that fire so many years ago, was beginning his own life, his own story. Jacob showed an aptitude for working with horses that surpassed even Gabe's skill. By the time he was 15, he was breaking and training horses that others had given up on, with a patience and instinct that seemed almost magical. Gabe watched him with pride, seeing himself in his son but also seeing something unique, something entirely Jacob's own. Sarah grew up to be a teacher like her mother, with a fierce intelligence and a passion for education. She campaigned for a proper schoolhouse in Silver Peak and eventually got one, becoming its first official teacher at the age of 19. Young William was the wild one, always dreaming of adventures beyond Nevada, talking about traveling to San Francisco or even further. Grace saw in him the same restlessness that had driven Gabe in his younger years, and she hoped he would find his way home as Gabe eventually had. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Gabe took Grace back to the spot where the old stable had stood. A new building occupied the space now, much improved and well-maintained, but they both still remembered the flames, the terror, the miracle of survival. "I've been thinking," Gabe said as they stood hand in hand, "about how that day changed everything, how one moment of crisis led to all of this." He gestured broadly, encompassing the ranch, the house where their children were growing up, the life they had built together. "I used to feel guilty," Grace admitted, "for loving you, for moving on from William so quickly, but I've realized that the heart is more complicated than we think. I loved William, and I always will. He gave me Thomas and this ranch and showed me what a good marriage could be. But I love you too, Gabe, in a different way but no less deeply. You saved my son's life, and in doing so, you gave me permission to live again." Gabe pulled her close. "You saved me too. I was lost when I rode up to this ranch that day. I'd been lost for 12 years, running from my past, from my guilt, from everything that mattered. But you and Thomas gave me a reason to stay, to face my demons, to believe I could be more than my worst moment." "We saved each other," Grace said simply. They stood that way for a long time, watching the sun set over the mountains, grateful for the unexpected paths that had brought them together, for the love that had grown from tragedy, for the family they had created from ashes and hope. As full darkness fell, they walked back to the house together, their steps in sync after 2 decades of walking side by side. Light glowed from the windows, and they could hear the sound of their children's voices, laughter and argument and the ordinary chaos of family life. It was everything Grace had thought lost forever on that terrible day when fire threatened to take everything she loved. But from those flames had come Gabriel Zander, riding in without a word, without hesitation, risking everything for a child he did not know. And from that single act of courage had grown a love story that would last the rest of their lives. Years continued to pass in the way they do, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the cycles of seasons. Thomas and Catherine had 3 children of their own, and Grace delighted in being a grandmother, in holding babies again without the terror that had accompanied her own pregnancies. Jacob eventually married a quiet young woman from California who had come to Nevada to visit relatives and had fallen in love with both the cowboy and the land. Sarah remained unmarried, devoted to her school and her students, finding fulfillment in shaping young minds rather than raising her own children. William did eventually leave Nevada, but only temporarily. He traveled to San Francisco, worked on the docks for a year, saw something of the world, and then came home, declaring that nowhere else felt quite right. Gabe's hair turned silver at the temples, then went fully gray, but his strength remained. He could still work a full day, could still gentle a wild horse, could still make Grace's heart skip when he smiled at her in that particular way. Grace herself aged gracefully, her face lined with the evidence of a life fully lived, laugh lines around her eyes, worry lines on her forehead, the marks of joy and sorrow both. On their 30th anniversary, the family threw them a huge celebration. All their children and grandchildren were there, along with what seemed like half of Silver Peak. Pete, now ancient and bent but still sharp as ever, told stories about the early days of the ranch, about Grace struggling to learn ranching and Gabe building the new stable with his bandaged hands. Thomas, now a man of 33 with children of his own, stood up to give a toast. "I don't remember much about the day Papa Gabe came into our lives," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "I was only 3 years old. But I remember the feeling of being safe in his arms, of being carried out of the fire. And every day since then, he's made me feel that same way, safe, protected, loved. He didn't have to stay. He didn't have to become my father. But he chose to, and that choice made all the difference in my life." There was not a dry eye in the house. Gabe stood and embraced Thomas, and Grace watched her two men together, the son who had survived the fire and the man who had saved him, bound together by more than blood, by choice and love and 30 years of shared life. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the house was quiet, Grace and Gabe climbed the stairs to their bedroom. It was the same room they had shared since their wedding night, though the furnishings had been updated over the years. Gabe helped Grace out of her good dress, his hands still gentle, still reverent even after 3 decades of marriage. "Tired?" he asked. "Exhausted," Grace admitted. "But happy, so very happy." They lay in bed together, Grace's head on Gabe's shoulder, his arm around her. It was their favorite position, the way they had slept almost every night of their marriage. Outside, the Nevada night was clear and cool, stars scattered across the black sky like diamonds. "You ever think about how different our lives would be if you had ridden past that day?" Grace asked softly. "Sometimes," Gabe admitted, "but I try not to dwell on the what-ifs. I'm just grateful for what is." "What is," Grace repeated. "A good life, a full life, more than I ever hoped for after William died." "More than I ever deserved," Gabe said, "but I've tried to earn it. Every day I've tried to be worthy of the trust you placed in me, of the love you gave me." Grace tilted her head to look up at him. You've been the best husband, the best father. You've built something beautiful here, Gabe, not just the ranch but the family. Our children are good people, and that's because of you as much as me." "We did it together," Gabe corrected. "Everything we've built, we built together. Partners, remember, partners," Grace agreed. She kissed him softly. "I love you, Gabriel Zander. I have loved you for 30 years, and I will love you for however many years we have left. And I love you, Grace. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. You and our children, you're everything." They drifted off to sleep that way, secure in each other and in the life they had created. Outside, the ranch slept too, the horses in their stable, the cattle in the pastures, the land stretching out under the stars. It was all exactly as it should be. The final years of their lives were golden ones. They handed over most of the ranch operations to Thomas and Jacob, becoming advisors rather than workers, enjoying the luxury of watching rather than doing. They traveled a bit, visiting Gabe's parents in Colorado one last time before they passed, taking a train trip to San Francisco that William arranged for them, marveling at the changing world even as they remained rooted in the land they loved. Grace's health began to fail when she was 68. It was her heart, Dr. Chen's successor explained, worn out from a lifetime of hard work and stress. There was nothing to be done but make her comfortable and wait. Grace accepted the diagnosis with the same practical courage she had faced everything else in her life. She put her affairs in order, made sure Gabe knew where all the important papers were, said her goodbyes to each of her children and grandchildren. Gabe never left her side during those final weeks. He sat with her for hours, holding her hand, telling her stories about their life together, reminiscing about the good times and even some of the hard times. Grace drifted in and out of consciousness, but she always knew when Gabe was there. His presence was as constant as the sun rising, as reliable as the seasons changing. One evening in late autumn, as the sun was setting over the mountains in a blaze of gold and red, Grace opened her eyes and found Gabe watching her. "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know," Gabe replied, his voice thick with unshed tears. "You've never been afraid of anything. Will you be all right after? Eventually, the children will help, and I'll have the memories. We've had a good life, Grace, better than good, extraordinary." Grace smiled. "We have no regrets." "Not a single one. I love you, Gabe. Thank you for riding into that fire. Thank you for staying. Thank you for everything. Thank you for letting me stay. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for our family." Gabe lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I'll see you again. Someday." "Wait for me." "I will," Grace promised. "And William will be there too. You'll finally get to meet him." "I'd like that." Grace's eyes drifted closed. Her breathing slowed, became shallow. Gabe held her hand and talked to her softly, telling her it was all right to let go, that he would be fine, that the children would be fine, that everything they had built would continue. As the last light faded from the sky, Grace Lawton Zander took one final breath and was still. Gabe sat with her for a long time after, holding her hand, memorizing her face, saying goodbye to the woman who had been his partner, his love, his whole world for 32 years. When he finally stood and called for the children, his heart was broken but not destroyed. Grace had taught him too well about resilience, about carrying on, about finding light even in the darkest moments. They buried Grace on a hill overlooking the ranch, next to the spot where William's grave already stood. Gabe had no jealousy about this. Grace had loved them both, and there was room in her heart and in death for both her husbands. The whole town turned out for the funeral, testament to the woman Grace had been, the lives she had touched through her teaching and her kindness. Gabe lived for 3 more years after Grace died. They were lonely years in some ways, but he filled them with his children and grandchildren, with the work of the ranch, with the satisfaction of seeing everything he and Grace had built continuing to thrive. Thomas ran the ranch now with Jacob's help, and they did it well, honoring the foundation their parents had laid on a spring morning when the desert was blooming with unexpected wildflowers. Gabe woke with a strange sense of peace. He rose and dressed, moving more slowly than he once had, feeling every one of his 73 years. He went outside and walked through the ranch, seeing it all with new eyes: the stable he had built with burned hands, the house where he had raised 4 children, the corrals where he had trained hundreds of horses, the land that had become home in a way no place had been since he left Colorado as a young man running from grief. He walked to the hill where Grace was buried and sat down between her grave and William's. The stone was simple but well kept, tended regularly by the children. He traced Grace's name with one finger, remembering her face, her voice, her laugh. "I kept my promise," he said aloud. "I made sure everyone was taken care of. The ranch is doing well. The children are happy. Thomas is a good man, Grace. You'd be so proud of him. All of them, really. They're all good people." He sat for a while longer, feeling the sun on his face, hearing the wind in the grass. He thought about the day he had ridden toward smoke on the horizon, not knowing that decision would change his entire life. He thought about the moment he had seen Grace for the first time, desperate and terrified, begging for help. He thought about carrying Thomas out of the flames, about the first time Grace had smiled at him, about the first time they had kissed. He thought about 32 years of marriage, 4 children, countless sunsets watched from the porch, laughter and tears, and the simple everyday moments that made up a life. It had been a good life, better than he had any right to expect. He had been given a second chance, a redemption he had not known he needed, and he had tried his best to be worthy of it. When Thomas found him later that afternoon, Gabe was lying peacefully between the 2 graves, his eyes closed, his expression serene. The doctor said his heart had simply stopped, worn out from a lifetime of hard work and deep feeling. The family mourned but also celebrated, knowing that Gabe had lived fully and loved deeply and was now reunited with the woman who had been his everything. They buried him next to Grace as he had requested. The stone was simple, matching hers, with just his name and the dates of his life and a single line underneath. He rode into the fire. It was Thomas who had chosen the inscription, remembering the day that had brought his papa into their lives, the moment of courage that had changed everything. The ranch continued for generations after that, passed down through Thomas's line, and then his children's children. The story of Gabe and Grace became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. The tale of the burning stable, the cowboy who rode into the flames without a word, the widow and her son, and the love that grew from tragedy became part of the family's identity, a reminder of where they came from and what they valued. The land itself seemed to remember. On autumn evenings when the light turned golden, ranch hands swore they could sometimes see 2 figures on the hill where the graves stood, sitting together and watching the sunset. It was just a trick of the light, of course, shadows and imagination. But it was a comfort nonetheless. The idea that Gabe and Grace were still there somehow, still watching over the land they had loved, still together, as they had promised to be. And far away in Colorado, in a small cemetery near the ranch where Gabe had grown up, there was another grave that had gone untended for many years. But after Gabe's death, his children made the journey to visit it, to place flowers on the grave of the uncle they had never met, the boy named Jake, whose tragic death had set in motion a chain of events that led to their own existence. They stood in that Colorado cemetery and thanked Jake for his unknowing sacrifice, for the grief that had driven Gabe away from home and eventually led him to Nevada, to Silver Peak, to a burning stable and a desperate widow and a child who needed saving. Because in the end, that was what it had all been about: saving and being saved, loving and being loved, finding home in unexpected places and unexpected people. Gabe had ridden into the fire without a word because it was what needed to be done. He had stayed because Grace and Thomas had given him a reason to stop running. And together, they had built something that lasted far beyond their own lives, a legacy of love and courage that would echo through the generations. The burning stable had trapped her child, and the cowboy had ridden into the fire without a word. From that moment had come everything else: a love story written in the hard language of the Wild West, in dust and sweat and determination, in quiet words spoken under starlight, in the everyday heroism of building a life together against all odds. It was a story that began with fire and fear but ended with family and fulfillment, proof that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes, that courage can change everything, and that love, when it comes, is worth any risk.